ahead and get started. Welcome. This is the Responding to the Critics event sponsored by St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess. I am the chair of the center. My name is Carrie Frederick Frost, and I'm so glad to see all of you this evening. I'm going to start us off in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Most holy Phoebe, who is found to be worthy of the diaconate, who was Paul's helper and carried his words to the people of Rome, who is called the lamp of Centurea, we now humbly ask that you intercede for us and pray to Christ our God for us as we discern his will for the revival of the ordained female diaconate for the upbuilding of the entire church today. Pray that we will be blessed and fruitful in our works this day and always, to God's glory. Amen. Again, welcome to the St. Phoebe Center's event, Responding to the Critics. Tonight, board member Anne-Marie Macera will moderate, and so I'll turn the floor over to you, Anne-Marie.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Tonight, we will address some of the most common and frequently stated concerns, questions, and criticisms by those opposed to the revival of the female diaconate and the work of the St. Phoebe Center. If you have a particular question that you would like us to address, we invite you to submit it in the chat. The chat for this evening is open only to correspondence to and from the hosts and co-hosts. In addition, all participants have been muted. This session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. The format for this evening will be conversational and informal. I will ask a particular panelist to address a specific issue. If there is time, I will ask the other panelists to respond. At the end, we will address as many questions or comments from the chat as possible. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I would like to address one of the most commonly asked questions and critiques of the St. Phoebe Center. What is our motivation as an organization? Answering that question starts with me as the founder of the St. Phoebe Center. My work for the church began in early adulthood when I served in various roles, first in the Greek Orthodox Church, and then in the OCA on local, national, and diocesan levels, serving on committees, councils, task forces, and more. During that time, I became aware of an order within the tradition of the church that ministered to women, particularly the female diaconate. I saw the unique needs and gifts of women that were often overlooked. I imagined the possibilities of reviving this order to meet the needs of women, who make up more than half of our church, as well as meeting the ministerial needs of the entire church today. I met with my former parish priest, Archpriest Father Daniel Rental, may his memory be eternal. And he encouraged me on this path, saying, yes, you can do this. I also discussed it with my bishop. And so the intention from the very start was about reviving this beautiful ordained ministry of service, which is what the diaconate is all about. Thus, we were surprised that some people thought this was all about power, or that we had a hidden agenda of wanting the female priesthood, or that we wanted to do what men are doing so we can feel and be valued. Let it be clear then that our motivation is not wanting power or the female priesthood. Rather, our motivation from the beginning was one of service, using the gifts, talents, and experiences of all God's people to build up the body of Christ and to meet the needs of all God's people. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce to you this evening's panelists. Father Radu Bordeianu is a professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. His research focuses on ecumenical ecclesiology. He served as president of the Orthodox Theological Society of America, is a member of the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation, and co-chair of the Romanian Orthodoxy group of the International Orthodox Theological Association. He is also involved in local intra-Christian and Christian-Jewish dialogues. Reverend Father Dr. Bordeianu is on the advisory board of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess. Welcome, Father.
It's good to be here.
Dr. Teva Regule holds a Master of Divinity degree at Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology. And there she is, okay. She holds a Master of Divinity degree at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology and a PhD in systematic theology, focusing on liturgical theology and history from Boston College. She has served the church for many years, focusing on youth work, the participation of women in the church, especially its liturgical life, and liturgical renewal more broadly. Teva has served as an Orthodox consultant for a number of consultations on women and men in the church, sponsored by the World Council of Churches, and she is on the board of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Dr. Valerie Karras, who I believe was running a little bit late. Do we know if she is here?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, wonderful. There you are. Very good. Very good. Dr. Valerie Karras holds a Master of Theological Studies degree from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology and 2 doctoral degrees. She has earned doctorates in patristic theology from the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki and in church history from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Dr. Karras has served as assistant professor at both Holy Cross and Helena College and is an adjunct instructor of religion at Lindenwood University. Her areas of research interest include women in early and Byzantine Christianity, gender in early church theology, and Orthodox Christianity in ecumenical, interreligious, and feminist conversation. She has been widely invited to lecture, also presenting papers at numerous academic conferences throughout the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Karras is on our advisory board of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess, and I welcome you.
Thank you.
So we're going to get started talking first about history of the diaconate, and this would be biblical early church and major orders. And we're going to start, Valerie, if I can start with you, if you would respond to the first set of questions.
Sure.
Okay. So, yes.
Go ahead. Sorry. I'm trying to get out of full screen mode here.
Oh, okay.
So I can see the questions on my computer. Okay, I think I've got that now. Oh, and
Okay.
I also wanted to start by congratulating Father Radu for being promoted to full professor at Duquesne. I should also admit that I'm not teaching adjunct anymore at Lindenwood for the last several years. Taking care of my 101-year-old mother has become virtually a full-time job. So that's life for the
God bless you for that. So
Um,
I would like to start, if I can, Valerie, with the first question, if I can. And one of the questions we get is whether deaconesses are mentioned in the Bible.
There are actually 2 references to female deacons in the New Testament. The first is at the end of the Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans, chapter 16, where he gives a variety of hails, greetings to various people. And one of the first people that he mentions is, in fact, Phoebe, who is a deaconess, a deacon. It's used with the masculine ending, not deaconess, not diakonissa, but diakonos, in the I think in the genitive of the Church of St. Cray, and it's clear that he sees her, as a fellow worker, as someone who is a part of the church. I don't know if we would want to call it administration, certainly the clergy of that church. It's interesting. This is where we're going to see this over and over again, particularly in modern history, how people interpret texts with their own presuppositions. So although the text says deacon, using that word diakonos, and although it was certainly understood as being a reference to a female deacon in the early church by early church writers such as Origen in Alexandria, Egypt at the end of the 2nd and beginning of the 3rd century, and most notably St. John Chrysostom in the late 4th, early 5th century, we find that more modern English translations, for instance, tended to translate it in a generic sense as servant. And it's only been over the last 2 or 3 decades, because of the extensive research that's been done on the female diaconate, that has been restored to its original sense of female deacon, and not simply a generic servant of some sort. The other reference is in 1 Timothy. And that writer spends some time over the course of several chapters, from chapter 3 to chapter 5, talking about the various clergy in the church, and more specifically, bishops, deacons, and widows, and talks about, in the section on the deacons, after talking about what kind of qualifications they should have, moral qualifications, and who they are as persons, says, and the women also. And again, this is something where St. John Chrysostom, in his homilies on 1 Timothy, makes it clear that it doesn't make sense to understand this in any other way but as female deacons, because the wives of other clergy are not mentioned in that same way, even though, for instance, when the epistle writer is talking about the bishop, mentions specifically that he should be the husband of one wife, and yet says nothing about what kind of qualifications the wife should have, but goes on to talk at some length about the women also, what their qualifications should be. So I think it's important to see, and this is where it's very important to see, that we are not biblical fundamentalists who simply look at a text out of nowhere and simply apply our modern mindset to it without also understanding the historical context in which it was written, and understanding how did those in the early church understand that text. And in these cases, we see that, in fact, the early church understood these texts as referring to female deacons.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie. So what I'd like to do is then ask you, was it some people think she wasn't really ordained. Was she? And if she was it to a major order? We've also heard that, well, she was ordained, but it's not a major order. So can you speak to both of those things?
Yeah, she was clearly ordained, and the word for ordination, hierotonia, is used with respect to the ordination of the female deacon. And yes, it was to what we today call major orders. And even though the terms that we use today to distinguish between major and minor orders, the Greek terms that we use today, hierotonia for major orders, hierothesia for minor orders, which we sometimes will translate as tonsure rather than ordination. Even though those terms are quite distinct in our modern theological vocabulary, and they were more fluid in early to early Byzantine times, we nonetheless can see clearly that her ordination was to major orders because of the format of the ordination. And here it's really instructive to look at the work done almost a century ago by the famous Greek theologian Panagiotis Trembelas, who did an article specifically on this question of what differentiates heterotonia from heterothesia. And in his work, he placed as the most important elements that are seen over and over again throughout the centuries as being, when does the ordination occur, number one, and number two, where does the ordination occur? So in the case of ordinations to the three major orders, the ordination always occurs within the Eucharistic liturgy, number one, and number two, it occurs at the altar. By contrast, ordinations to minor orders, what we today call heterothesia, or sometimes called tonsure, those ordinations occur outside of both the Eucharistic liturgy as the context for it, and outside of the altar area. And anyone who has seen the ordination or tonsure of a subdeacon, for instance, or of a reader, is familiar with how that ordination occurs and when it might occur. For instance, might it be done after the Vesper service, or it might be done in between matins and liturgy, something like that. Whereas when you see the ordination to major orders, we see it's within the Eucharistic liturgy, and it normally occurs somewhere right before where the central liturgical focus of that particular ministry is. So for instance, the ordination of a presbyter is done shortly before the consecration prayer, because that's an important part of the presbyter, the priest's liturgical duties. For the deacon, the ordination is done later in the Eucharist because deacons do not celebrate the sacraments. This is one of the very important distinctions between the diaconate and the priesthood. The deacon's ministry is, as its name says, is one of service. It's a pastoral ministry, and it assists both liturgically and administratively and pastorally in the duties within the church community. So the deacon's ordination occurs shortly before the distribution of the Eucharist, because the deacon will assist with that distribution. So when we look at the female deacon's ordination, even in the early church, in the earliest rite that we have, and it's not a full ordination rite at all, it's simply a few rubrics mentioned, the apostolic constitutions from the 4th century makes it clear that this is occurring within the context of the Eucharist, and I would say also within the altar area, because for those three major orders, it always says that the ordinand, the person being ordained, is in the midst of those of the same ordination level, the same ministry, and those above. So when the male deacon is ordained, he is ordained in the midst of the deacons and the presbyters. When the female deacon is ordained, she is ordained in the midst of the deacons and the presbyters. By contrast, the subdeacon and reader are not described in that way at all. Now, when we get later into the Byzantine period and we have the full rite, the earliest being the Barberini 336 Greek Codex, we see that, in fact, that manuscript, as well as several others, don't even bother to give a complete ordination rite for the female deacon, and instead say it's to be done as it is for the male deacon, with such and such exceptions. And there are 3 or 4 minor exceptions. She's not kneeling, but the deacon is kneeling on one knee. She is not going to take the Eucharist out to the congregation. And I will talk about this maybe later, about the difference in ministry at that time that paralleled the difference in social functions of men and women. So men had external functions within the community. Women's functions were within the family, within the home. So the female deacon, like the male deacon, would take the Eucharist to people's homes, and specifically for female parishioners. We don't allow lay people to take the Eucharist. This is part of the liturgical ordained ministry. And it's very important to say that when I hear people say, well, you know, you can have women do these without being ordained. Why would you do that? We don't do that in the Orthodox Church. We make that's part of why one is ordained. So it's very clear. I saw something recently where someone tried to make an argument that the woman, the female deacon, was being ordained sort of in the altar area, but not actually at the altar, that it didn't specify at the altar. Well, remember that these rites have already said, we're not going to repeat everything that's the same, right? So whatever's not differentiated is done the same. Moreover, one of the things that is specifically mentioned, because it is different, since she's not going to distribute the Eucharist among the rest of the congregation at the liturgy, is that after she receives the Eucharist at the hands of the bishop, she replaces the cup on the altar. Now, it's hard to imagine how she's supposed to do that if she's not actually at the altar. And I have to thank oh my God, her name's just, Edith Humphrey, for pointing that out when that came up in an earlier broadcast several weeks ago. So it's very clear, you know, the time, the place, the context. It's also very clear from both canonical and civil legislation. In fact, the Emperor Justinian has a novella where he specifically mentions, he uses the term hierocini, priesthood, in its broad sense, saying specifically bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and he specifies both male and female. And so he includes them in that legislation as part of the hierocini, the priesthood in the broad sense. Obviously not the priesthood in the more specific sense of that particular ordained ministry.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And I want to say that this is definitely beyond Phoebe. You know, we started out, you talked about Phoebe, but now this is within the life of the church, the female diaconate more generally.
Yes.
And so that's very important, I think, to clarify. I am going to be a timekeeper here to try to keep us on task and not to run over. So we have 4 minutes for you, Valerie, and I have some other important questions I want to ask you. So I'm going to
Anne-Marie, can I interject just quickly? I wanted to add one thing to Valerie's comments, which were very good. 2 things. One is to point out the work of Evangelist Theodoro after Tremulous.
Yes, thank you.
And to emphasize that it was not only in the altar, in the sanctuary, but by the bishop, with 2 prayers, something that is unique to the major orders, one of which calls down the grace of God's grace, divine grace. And she received the stole and took communion at the altar with the major orders. And secondly, something that Valerie's own research has pointed out is in the listing of the orders, the female deacon, whether you're listing them in ascending or descending order, is always after the male deacon. So very much closely tied to that. So I don't think that there's, anyway, it's very well done, and we can continue.
Yeah, and thanks,
Thank
Teva,
you.
particularly for pointing out the research of Evangelos Theodorou, excuse me, who did in fact take Trembelis's distinction on hierotonia and hierothesia and looked at that question specifically with respect to the female diaconate. And that work was done some 60, 70 years ago.
Great, very good, thank you. So moving on, there has been the argument that the female diaconate was not widespread. And so because it wasn't a practice of the universal church, The entire church didn't really approve of it. And some have argued that there might have been this history that you tell us about of the deaconess, but it's not a tradition. So that's why we don't see them today. So how would you respond to this idea that it wasn't widespread? It's not part of our tradition now. What would you say to that, Valerie?
It's easy to answer that one very briefly. I have seen numismatic, epigraphical, and other documentary evidence of a female diaconate from southern Italy through the Middle East and North Africa. And it goes over a wide series of, set of centuries. You've got a reference to female deacons in a document from the Church of Jerusalem in the 12th century that is really talking more, it's in its rubrics, talking about the Easter Rite, about another female order, the myrrh bearers, the Mirofori, who also appear probably to have been ordained, although it doesn't talk about their ordination rite. But in the discussion of the processions, it mentions female deacons. So we know that they're in the Church of Jerusalem as late as the 12th century. We also see references in Byzantine documents. And I think probably the most important thing is that we have canonical legislation from several ecumenical councils dealing with female deacons. How much more universal do you need than canons from ecumenical councils? So I don't know where this idea comes up that somehow they're just scattered about in a few distinct locations but aren't widespread. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to now ask Teva and Father Radu if you have anything you would like to add to what Valerie has wonderfully shared with us regarding the history.
Well, I think she's done quite an admirable job. Father Radu?
Absolutely. And I will say that I am quite surprised, Anne-Marie, by the question you asked about some critics who are saying that this was not enough evidence. Oftentimes I see people just take one instance in history and try to make it the rule of our liturgical life today. And here we have Valerie presenting us with evidence throughout centuries. I have some more that I'm going to bring up later on. And they just don't understand how this is not enough. In other words, if a person is truly a traditionalist Orthodox, they cannot simply set that tradition to the side just because it doesn't fit their arguments today. If tradition is to inform our faith, then we really have to understand that this research is just overwhelming evidence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Father. I'm going to keep you spotlighted, Father, because I'm going to have a question for you. But also I want to remind everybody who is here that if you do have a question, please add it to the chat. And we as hosts and co-hosts will be able to see that. And hopefully we will be able to answer your questions. So feel free to do that. So moving on, Father, I want to ask you, this is something that we hear so often, that the female diaconate was really only about the baptism of women because of the issue of modesty. So they helped with that sacrament of baptism, chrismation, so we really don't have that anymore. So what it really is the need? Do you want to address that?
I would love to. Thank you for the question, because I want to preface by saying that orders throughout church history have changed. And the reasons why we had elders in the New Testament, which was, and actually the terms in the New Testament were quite interchangeably used. And then second, third centuries, we have elders who are much more in a administrative, let's say, capacity. By the 4th century, they become the ones who actually consecrate the Eucharist on a regular basis. orders have changed. In the New Testament, the motivation for deacons is to serve at the tables. And then we see it already in the 2nd century as a helper to the bishop. And then it becomes primarily that by the 4th century and to today. And so the idea that there was a function at a certain point in history, and if that function doesn't exist now, then the order has to go defunct. Again, it's a reading of Orthodox tradition that is not really faithful, because it has to acknowledge the work of the Spirit in guiding the church to its needs. But even the presupposition that deaconesses were primarily, or maybe exclusively for ordination of women, for baptism of women, I apologize, for baptism of women is actually not true. I have in front of me a 2nd century text, and this one is from the Didaskalia, in which bishops are told to ordain, to appoint deacons and then deaconesses. And for the explanation for the deaconesses, it says, for there are houses where you cannot send a deacon to the women on account of the heathens, but you may send a deaconess. Right? So the first explanation is that a male deacon going into the house of a heathen where they don't understand the kind of clergy that we have, then that would cause confusion, and it might question the intentions of the deacon going there, and it would give cause of scandal, because here is a man going into the house that is really not part of his family. So send a woman. That's what the Didaskalia says, right? Then it says, because there are in many other matters, the office of the woman deacon is required. That's where then it mentions how women were much more appropriate for the anointing of the other women, the adult women that were going into the waters of baptism, as well as when they come out of the waters of baptism, also to instruct them. This idea of instruction is very, very important. And I would point everybody here to the work of Carrie, Frederick Frost present here, who identifies several ways in which women can minister much more meaningfully to other women. And that's not a 21st century idea. Carrie, thank you for emphasizing it. But here we have it in the 2nd century, where this Didaskalia says that the ministry of a woman deacon is especially needful and important. So it recognizes that the woman ministering is important. Then it says how the Lord was ministered to by by Mary Magdalene, Mary, the daughter of James, and so forth. And then it says that women's ministry is needed to visit those who are sick. You see how it's not about baptism. To minister to those who are poor, to bathe those who have begun to recover from illness. And especially this visitation aspect of it was intrinsic to the diaconate. The fact that the diaconate today is so focused on liturgical matters was probably marginal in those earlier centuries, and the ministry outside of the church, the liturgy after the liturgy, was much more central. And again, if we want to be traditionalists, if we want to go back to tradition, then we really need to consider these aspects, that the diaconate is also concerned with serving the poor. And you know, indeed, today, people are being cared for in hospitals. There are professionals who take care of those who are sick. But does that mean that the visitation ministry is not needed? Please don't say that. Throughout my 26 years of priesthood, I have visited a lot of people in the hospital. If my ministry there is redundant, then if anybody thinks that that ministry is redundant, then they don't really understand what it means to be at the hospital bed of somebody in suffering. And when we are at the hospital bed of somebody in suffering, it's not just emotional support, it's not just counseling. Because, you know, some of the critics are saying, well, women can give each other emotional support and counseling. But I will say from my experience in the ministry that visiting those who are sick is much more than that. Because when I go and visit somebody in the hospital, I also read for them the official prayers of the church. I anoint them with holy unction. I give them communion. And in my parish, it's Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, we have an absolutely wonderful visitation ministry with numerous lay people who go and just visit those who are sick in the hospital. And I did ask the leaders of that ministry, what else would you like to do? And they said, to offer the official prayers of the church, to give sacraments. So you see, it's not just about baptism. But let me return to the question in some rather humorous way, at least for me. I thought that this was really interesting. I want to tell you that in the year 612, so we're talking about the 7th century, Valerie already pointed out to all those centuries later that we still have women ministry. In the 7th century, most people were baptized as infants, correct? And so you would presume that women deaconesses are not needed anymore. But hear this. Patriarch Sergius in the year 612 is looking at the clergy that are on the payroll of Hagia Sophia. And he says, these are too many people. We're spending so much money on the clergy. By the way, probably something you hear in parishes today too. But here it is. We're spending so much money on these clergy. Let's reduce the number of clergy. And so he reduced their number to 80 priests, 40 deaconesses. 40 deaconesses. This is how the number went down in the 7th century. Who can make any arguments that they were not needed if at Hagia Sophia, when they reduced the number, there are 40? And then there is all the other evidence that Valerie gave. In the first millennium, we're not talking about the second millennium. And so the argument that women were needed only for adult baptism of women just cannot be supported from history.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Father. I'd like to ask Valerie and Teva if you have anything that you would like to add with those various duties.
I would only add, I was just going to say, I would add that serving as chaperone is one of the duties listed in the Apostolic Constitutions, which is a 4th century document. And I think that that's something that could serve importantly today as well. It is not a modern phenomenon that we have this question of clergy sexual misconduct and he said, she said. And having a female clergy person to serve in addition when female parishioners are meeting with male clergy is it protects both the female parishioner and the clergyman who may be unjustly accused of sexual misconduct. I would also point out that it expanded in ministry to include important monastic offices. So abbesses and choir masters were often made ordained as deacons. And one of the most famous examples we have is Saint Irene Chrysovalanton. And this is in the 9th century. It is the Patriarch Methodius, the one who helped preside over the final restoration of the icons at the end of the second wave of iconoclasm, who ordained her as a female deacon and then set her up as abbess of that women's monastery.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to add or ask Teva a question now, and then I will come back to Father Radu. But, Teva, Father mentioned this idea that he asked these people who went and visited the sick, what else would you rather do? Or what else would you like to do in addition to what you're already doing? So we do hear often that lay women are already doing so many of the things that the deaconesses did. Anyone, if we hear anything, it's anyone can visit the sick, which is very true. But what is it about that ordination then? Where is the downfall for just anybody visiting the sick? Can you speak to the value, the significance of that ordination?
Sure. Thank you, Anne-Marie. First, I think it's important to realize that lay people, both men and women, are doing a lot of diaconal work in the church. They're oftentimes chaplains, spiritual directors, chanters, readers, homilists, philanthropic outreach coordinators, Christian educators, missionaries. So the question we are often asked is then, well, if they were doing all this, why do they have to be ordained? And I would like to start with actually a fundamental assertion, and that is that there is really only one ministry in the church, and that is Christ's ministry. And that is something that we are all, clergy and laity, called to participate in. We are all ordained, if you will, at our baptism and chrismation. We are anointed as priest, prophet, and king to participate in the life of the priest, prophet, and king. So we don't want to minimize the laity. The lay ministry is very important. But it's also important to realize that in like the 2nd or 3rd century, you start to see kind of from within this royal priesthood, a formal pattern, a threefold formal pattern of ministry emerging. And that is what we now call the bishop or the episcopos, the presbyterate, which we often call the priest, and the deacon. So in addition to this question that, or perhaps more formally, what does it mean to be ordained within an Orthodox context? And unlike Roman Catholic theology, or at least classic Roman Catholic theology, we don't believe that there is an ontological change that happens in ordination. And unlike some Protestant theology, we don't believe that it's just a functional category. Metropolitan John Zizioulas of blessed memory, probably one of the most foremost theological thinkers of our day, articulates it or says that it's really, you set aside someone for ministry and it changes the relationship within the context of the community. So in addition, or an ordination would then enliven their gifts by the Holy Spirit. Ordination fundamentally is tied to the Eucharist, as Valerie has shown, or at least ordination to minor or major orders. It's the foundation of the ordination. All the major orders are ordained during the Eucharistic celebration at the altar by the bishop. And their service is then tied to the altar as kind of the source and then the summit of their service. And the deacon in particular, the service of the deacon is actually to tie kind of the liturgy of our lives to the communal celebration. I think practically speaking, an ordination sets up a reciprocal relationship between the church and the ordained. They are given the support and the authority of the church, but then they are also accountable to the church. They can't just say anything. There's no loose cannons, as we might say. They are obedient to the church through her bishops, and they are trained and vetted from the church. So they represent the church to the people. They are the face of the church to the people. I think one example that I'll give in this context is this pastoral care example, similar to what Father Radu just mentioned. Social visits are very important to the sick and infirm, especially they often feel very, very isolated. It's very good and it's encouraging to visit the sick. And just being there and often kind of praying with them can be very, very helpful. Now, how can we distinguish that between perhaps a chaplain, someone who is actually trained and endorsed? They also visit, but they are actually trained to listen and to guide the sick and infirm for whatever kind of spiritual questions they may have, and to lead them in prayer. And then now, how can that be different? So that's very important ministry. And how can that now be different from a deaconess? Similarly, they visit, they are trained to listen, to guide, but they in fact can use the prayers of the church. They can take communion to the sick and infirm, and in some cases anoint them, especially kind of female body parts, as you can say. They can take the concerns of the sick and infirm kind of back to the assembly in prayer and petition, and then take the prayer of the assembly back to the sick and infirm, kind of connecting them and allowing them as kind of to see the face of the church through them. And they can then, I think the sick and infirm would be very comforted knowing that, in fact, the community is praying for them through this person, and they can bring that with them. So we can see various levels of ministry that are very important, each in their own right, but each has a little more perhaps to a little different focus. And this is what we were talking about here. And I think similarly, the same thing goes with spiritual counseling. I mean, we often hear, well, you know, you can just go to another woman, or you could go to your priest, or you could go to a monastic. Why do you have to be kind of ordained to do that? And I think many of us do approach our priest for spiritual counseling. Oftentimes, though, they're quite busy. They may not be trained in this area. And for women especially, I think they might not be comfortable discussing maybe women type things, reproduction, miscarriages, domestic abuse, marital problems, any kind of female illnesses, anything like that. Then you could say, well, we could go to monastic. And if you went to a nun, they might be able to be more sensitive to women's concerns. But a monastic tonsure does not mean that they are a trained spiritual guide. And not even, in addition, they're not always trained in Orthodox theology. So, and sometimes that we've heard, at least certainly a number of cases in which maybe the spiritual guidance that they've given can be quite dubious in a lot of cases. So they don't have any formal blessing nor accountability to the church for the particular guidance. So a deaconess, how could a deaconess kind of enter this and be helpful and to those who seek her counsel? I think like a nun, she can be much more sensitive to the concerns of women, but she would also be trained in spiritual direction and also in Orthodox theology. She was accountable to the church, and she then carries the authority of the church so that the person who is counseled knows that they can have confidence in what she's saying, that is, in fact, guiding her more fully into the life of the church. So that's how I would kind of make those distinctions in terms of why an ordination would be helpful and how it can look practically in these various scenarios.
Thank you. Teva, in the chat, there is a question about deaconesses, the ability of them to anoint. Is this an Orthodox sacrament? Because in the Roman Catholic Church, deacons cannot sacramentally anoint. Can you speak to that, please?
Well, that is a question in terms of usually it is a role of the, today at least, we see it as a role of the presbyter or the bishop. In antiquity, you did have women anointing because of, especially at the chrismation, because of the particular sensitivity to and modesty associated with that. So it's not out of the kind of out of the realm of possibilities. And in 1990, we had a conference in Crete, and I can speak to this later, in which they tried to imagine what kind of things a future female deacon could do. And they talk about, taking communion to the sick and distributing them, praying with them. And one of the things they also mentioned was this possibility of anointing the infirm, especially. So it's not something that we have just all of a sudden come up with. This is something that the church has been thinking about at least for the last 35 years.
Thank you. One last quick question before I move on to Father Radu, Teva, that I would like to ask you. It has been said, and I've heard it personally, that women, and Valerie, I believe, mentioned this a bit, but I'd like to get your take, give you an opportunity, Teva, that women, if they have issues, they can go to their priest, or they can even go to a nun for spiritual counseling. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that was in my comments earlier. I kind of directed that as kind of my second example. So similarly, as I mentioned before, kind of the different categories of and the differences between perhaps going to a male clergy versus going to a female monastic versus perhaps a deaconess. So in the interest of time, I won't repeat it, but we can continue then.
Thank you. And I apologize. I'm going back and forth between trying to listen and look at questions that I have here and trying to get to the chat. So I apologize for that. I would like to go to Father Radu, and this is, we're going to challenge you here, Father, because we have in the chat some questions that you are going to be speaking to. And one of the things that we have heard that women are, excuse me, are forbidden from entering the altar or the sanctuary, to be more clear. And that's a big issue here with, an ordination, that they're forbidden from entering the altar / sanctuary because of their monthly flow of blood. And I'm going to ask you to speak to that, but also there was a question here that is, let's see. Okay, here is a question from the chat that addresses this. My priest said that technically, and this is from the chat, not me saying, my priest said that technically women who are menstruating should not receive communion, although this is not enforced everywhere, and he does not enforce this. The reason for this is that Eve received menstruation as a punishment. This directly contradicts the fact that women have been deacons and served at the altar. How can I argue with my priest about this?
Well, we've been hearing throughout the evening, myself including, saying that women are better equipped to talk about women's issues. And here you're asking me about something I have never experienced before. Although the Bible does say that Job kind of gave birth, that out of his loins came 3 children, 7 boys, 3 daughters, something like that. But no. So that's an uncomfortable position for me. But let me answer. I'm not getting away from it. When looking at the Bible, I see no evidence that Eve started menstruating after the fall. On the contrary, before the fall, in Genesis 1, God blesses Adam and Eve, humankind in general, doesn't mention Adam and Eve, but humankind, to multiply. And with what we know about the menstrual cycle, that is a precondition for human beings to multiply. It is actually a gift from God given in the Garden of Eden, and something that enables us to have children. And I will not see it as a punishment. I just do not see the evidence in the Bible. Let me mention something else in the Bible. In the New Testament, we see that Jesus is surrounded by crowds, and there's a woman with the flow of blood who touches him. Obviously, it doesn't go too much into details what that flow of blood was, but I hope you can all imagine what it probably was, right? She was having issues. And so she went and touched Jesus' garment. And then she was healed instantly. Also remember that this would not have been allowed by the law, because according to Jewish purity rituals, Jewish purity legislation, a woman menstruating was considered unclean, and so she was not allowed to be in public and touch other human beings. But she touched Jesus, and Jesus healed her. What do you do with that if you're an early Christian? Well, as we all know from the first Apostolic Council in the year 50, they did away with all the purity laws. They said, just don't eat food that was with a lot of blood. So did away with all these purity laws. And so fast forward a little bit to the Syriac Didaskalia, another very early document that instructs women to receive communion when menstruating. Why? Because if the menstruating woman touched the garment of Jesus and she was healed, how much more spiritual and physical benefits will we have by receiving communion, which is the entire body and blood of Christ, not just the hem of his garment, but the entire body and blood of Christ. And so, in accordance with early Christian apostolic practice and with these, you would think that the rule about women's purity would not exist. But it has come back into Christianity through an Egyptian strand, for example, which is closer to the Semitic tradition, through some heretical views that disregarded the body in general. And these purity laws have been reintroduced from the Old Testament into the life of the church. But listen, exclusively applied to women. There are no purity laws, as there were in the Old Testament, that apply to men. So as a male, I'm allowed to touch a dead body and I don't become impure, correct? Which in the Old Testament, I would have become impure. We don't have purity laws that apply to males. There is a very, very obscure tradition somewhere, I know it, I don't want to get into details, where a man can become a little bit impure, but then he just washes himself and everything is fine. So there are no ways for a man to become ritually impure in this way. Why did we apply them only to women? I'm not going to answer this question right now, but use your imagination. And so this idea of ritual impurity was reintroduced later, and it's not in accordance with the earlier apostolic tradition. Now, we have also discovered so much more about human reproduction in recent centuries. In fact, the female ova were discovered only in the 18th century, if I remember correctly, or early 19th, I think late 18th, if I remember correctly. And so with what we know about human reproduction, the idea that somebody could become impure and somehow not pleasing to God, or having to stay away from holy things because of a gift that God gave, which makes reproduction possible, it's difficult to understand. I should stop there, right?
Father, I have to thank you for your lovely response, and especially coming from a male, a priest. Thank you so much. I believe, Valerie, you are still here. Thank you. I know that you have to leave early because you were wanted on another in another presentation, but I do want to open it up to you, Valerie and Teva, to respond, especially because somebody in the chat did say that they wanted to add to their question that a priest cannot serve if he has a bleeding cut. So Teva and or Valerie, would you like to respond to that and add to what Father Radu beautifully shared with us?
Well, I think Father Radu, he pointed to briefly to that idea that this comes from one particular area of the church. It's interesting to me that some critics earlier were claiming that, the female diaconate wasn't universal enough. Well, this idea of ritual impurity, particularly menstrual ritual impurity, is something that you see in the Church of Alexandria, but not in the rest of the Christian church in the early centuries. And as he pointed out, with the Didaskalia Apostolorum, I would also emphasize again St. John Chrysostom, who in several of his homilies, with respect, for instance, to sexual congress and marriage and to childbirth, talks about how these are natural bodily functions, that these are given from God, and that there is nothing ritually impure about this. So I think that's really important. The person who mentioned, well, a priest with a bleeding wound. So they're still using that idea of blood ritual impurity. But as Father Radu also pointed out, this question was settled at the very first council, the Council of Jerusalem, that's described in Acts, where they specify that Gentiles who become Christian are not bound by the Mosaic law. So there's a real problem when we have something that came from one region of the church take over as the maxim for the entire church. And I believe, and Teva, you can probably answer this, didn't the Patriarchate of Antioch within the last decade or two actually put out a pastoral statement about doing away with this, which is not surprising to me, since it was the Church of Antioch that was most explicit about getting rid of this notion of ritual impurity in the early church.
Yes, the Synod of Antioch in 1997 actually formally abrogated those prohibitions for women. One thing I wanted to add to this idea, I think that just from a practical level, when you talk about priests with the cut, certainly you don't want them bleeding on the altar. What they usually do is they excuse themselves and they put a Band-Aid on it, right? And so what we're mostly talking about women prior to the advent of feminine hygiene products. So it's sort of like where they would perhaps actually be, have a blood trail and or had to be isolated as a result of that. So now, of course, we have female hygiene products that will, function similarly to the Band-Aid. And I think that that's something that we can at least bring to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. So it is 8:03 right now, and I still have a question for Teva. We've got some good questions in the chat. And so I want to go to Teva to ask her a question before we move on. And Teva, that what we're hearing, oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the I'm ahead of myself. Father Radu, I would like to ask you a question before I move to Teva. My apologies. Recently, and I'm going to share a quote here, but recently some have argued that women should not be ordained into leadership roles because women should not have authority over men. And I'm going to share a quote, and this is from a certain publication that attempts to support this claim. And I'm quoting, "The man is created first and given dominion over all. Thus, woman is created as an help. As the man names the creatures under him, so he also names the woman." End quote. And then another quote related to the fall, "The weakness of woman is thus her susceptibility to deception, or to put it more positively, her willingness to be led, which is part of her created nature as a helpmeet for the man, rather than a result of her transgression. God made the woman a fitting companion for the man, suited by her nature to follow the man's lead." And unquote. So can you speak to that? And then I will ask Teva and Valerie to also speak to that. You're getting a lot of tough questions here, Father.
Yeah, I'm right now trying to think. Okay, let's go. The Bible is a very complex set of writings. And if I remember correctly, in Genesis 1, man and women are created after animals. Does it mean that animals have authority over us human beings? No. So the argument that man is created before the woman, I'm not sure how that works logically, to be honest with you. On the contrary, in Genesis 1, human beings, men and women, are told, "You shall have dominion over the animals of the land and the air and the fish," and so on. We do not have dominion one over another. Human beings have no dominion over other human beings, which in that case was meant to say very clearly, every human being is the image of God, and you should not exercise dominion over the other. Now, like I said before, I've been ordained for 26 years. And as a man who is ordained for 26 years, that's why I was hesitating. I was thinking to myself, this person who writes like that, who might be a deacon of our church, I don't remember correctly. That's why I'm saying might. I'm not questioning, right? But I don't remember. What kind of understanding does he have on ordination? Is ordination having dominion over somebody else? If this is your view of ordination, please do not seek ordination, because ordination is about service. My boss washes feet. He does that during Holy Week. And he did that even to Judas, the one who betrayed him. we, priests, deacons, bishops, we are not in our positions to lord it over others. And to think of ordination as a means to have authority over another person is just a very, very misunderstood position. I really feel sorry for this person. When it comes to Adam and Eve, does Adam have authority over Eve because he was made first? Well, I assume that this person writes about Genesis chapter 2. But in Genesis chapter 2, it seems to me very clear that it's an account about how we human beings are in this world, male and female, and then we are going to be one. And that unification happens in the intimate act of marriage. A man shall leave his father and his mother, and he shall cling to his wife, and they shall be one. It's a very difficult text, you must admit, right? Because God is talking to Adam and Eve and talking to them about mother and father. They should have raised their hand and go, what's a mother, what's a father? Because they're the first human beings according to the story. But let's leave that aside. It's about unity. It's about being one. And when do we see subordination? After the fall. The subordination that we see in our society is not sanctified by the Bible. It is condemned by the Bible because it is presented as a consequence of the fall. And those who want to sanctify that subordination in the church want to sanctify a fallen order, not the order that God has intended. If we as a church are indeed an image of the kingdom of God, then we do not sanctify the fallenness of the world. We sanctify and we live as if we were in the kingdom of God. And so this argument leaves me wanting to say so much more because it is so infused with the spirit of this world. I know sometimes those who want the ordination of women to the diaconate are accused of being infused with the spirit of this world. And look how actually it's true about those who want to sanctify that kind of subordination, because the ordination is not about power. And if I support, which I do, the ordination of women to the diaconate, it's not because I want to give women more power, because that's not what ordination is about. And those who oppose it, because they want to keep women subordinated, like this person actually says in the 21st century, then that is consecrating a fallen state as if it were true. I better stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Father. Teva and Valerie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about Chrysostom again. Can you tell how much I've read from St. John Chrysostom? But he talks about, for instance, in his homily, 1 Corinthians, where St. Paul talks about male headship, and Chrysostom talks about how that means in terms of the source, that, you know, what we see in Genesis 2 about God taking from the side of Adam to create the woman, taking from the man to create the woman, that is what is meant by him being the head, as Christ, as the Father is the head of Christ, you know, that sense of the source. And so I think that's important. I also think I want to emphasize what Father Radu said, which is so important about the fact that this is, insofar as there is male domination of woman, it is named specifically in Genesis 3:16 as a consequence of the fall. And there are several consequences listed, including death, illness, pain in childbirth, toilsome labor. I want to know who among those who uphold male domination over woman as being God ordained then similarly uphold not using any technology, not using any modern medicine, because we're not supposed to try to extend life. We're not supposed to ease pain, because those are also God ordained, right? Those are all consequences of the fall that are all listed, one right after the other. The point is that that idea neglects completely the consequence of Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. And that has brought, we are in that in-between period now, that semi-eschatological period of now and yet, not yet. And so Chrysostom has some really wonderful language about how, in fact, in those same homilies, in that same homily on 1 Corinthians 11, talking about how if God had wanted to speak of like a master and slave, as you say, he would have used that instead of saying, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. So, I mean, you can find other things in Chrysostom where he's talking in terms of normal social context, but you also see where he says, for instance, with respect to 1 Corinthians 7, woman, how do you know if you shall save your husband? That the woman who is more spiritually advanced should be the one in charge, so to speak, at the head of that relationship, because she is the one who can help her husband spiritually. So he has a very flexible attitude that's all about what will best serve the church, what will best serve human beings, what will best bring people to God. And isn't that the whole point of the diaconal ministry, both male and female?
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. So
I have to leave now. So bye-bye.
And thank you so much. Thank you.
It was wonderful.
It's a pleasure having you here. I'd like to move things along because we're now at almost 8:15. I have one more question that I'm going to ask Teva, and then I'm going to open it up to both Teva and Father Radu about church unity. Okay, this should be interesting. But Teva, we often hear that ordination of women to the diaconate would lead to ordination of women to the priesthood. Can you, and that we actually have, that the St. Phoebe Center actually has this hidden agenda, that's what we're really after. Could you speak to this, please?
Okay, I think that is a common fear. I'd like to speak to two issues, that being the first one. I think first we have to understand actually the differences and the distinctions in our orders. As we mentioned earlier, we have kind of this threefold pattern of ordained ministry to the major orders. We have the bishop or the episcopos, who's normally understood as kind of the overseer of the community, someone for whom kind of speaks or kind of holds the church together, the unity of the church, and is the spokesperson for traditional doctrine. We have essentially his delegate or his deputy to the parish level, and that is the presbyter, who is the deputy to the local community, kind of the minister of the word and sacrament. It is through his hands that he offers our offer of the sacrifice of praise to God, and from his hands that we receive the peace of Christ. And then we have the deacon, and the deacon particularly connects the assembly to actually the bishop, to the worship of the church in general, because there were bishops and deacons long before there were actually priests as we know them today. And in particular, the diaconate represents kind of the interdependence of worship and service. Traditionally, of course, they were responsible for pastoral care, for the philanthropic work of the church, and for assisting in liturgy. They often prepared the gifts. They processed with the gifts, they took communion to the sick afterwards, and eventually then led petitions in the service as well. So it's grounded in the way that the church meets the world. It has its own charism, and it should really be looked at as its own ministry, not just a stepping stone to the presbyterate and not just a liturgical functionary. It connects kind of I've been saying, the liturgy of our lives to our communal celebration. We do have a history of women being ordained to this order, to the diaconate, for over 1,000 years. That's in our history without, quote unquote, ever moving up, if you would like to call it that. And the question of women or being ordained to the presbyterate is actually a fairly new question, I would say, in the life of the church, at least in the modern era, probably in the last 50 years. And it's actually has a whole different set of presuppositions to it. Because we don't have a historical basis for it, it would be an innovation. And it's really just a question that the church is just beginning to grapple with. Some of the issues are different than to the diaconate itself, because we have a distinction in our ministries, and yet they are related, but it's not the essence of the one priesthood that is then expressed three different ways in terms of that other traditions might understand their orders through that lens. I think what is often the example that's often thrown up is, well, look what the Episcopal Church did. They had deacons, today, and then now they had deacons, and now they have bishops, rather priests and bishops, and this is and everything else, and this is the road that we will go down if we have, women deacons. And I think that it really doesn't, that example, although it's part of our cultural landscape, it doesn't actually take into account, I think, the different understandings of priesthood, the different polities of the church, the different understandings of tradition, the different emphases that we have. I mean, in the Episcopal Church itself, the category of justice is very, very important. And the move to ordain women was really wrapped up in justice for women and equal rights. And those aren't the primary questions that we're concerned with here. We are concerned with a ministry of service that helps to build up the body of Christ by using the gifts of both men and women. I think probably a more apt comparison would be between us and different strands of Judaism, particularly conservative and Orthodox Judaism, who also are beginning to deal with these types of questions because of their the importance that they give to the tradition of the church. So at any rate, I guess I want to just say explicitly, we do say in our FAQs, and we've said continuously, that we do not promote the ordination of women to the presbyterate, that we are solely focused on the diaconate in elevating this ministry in particular, to build up the body of Christ and really in our mission to the world. So I think that is kind of succinctly how I would like to answer that question. There is another question I think that is somewhat similar to that, and I just wanted to address it before we move on to our last question. And that is this idea, that the St. Phoebe Center, you're not really, reinstituting the order, you're doing something totally new. Okay, that how you're envisioning this ministry is not really kind of within the history of the church. And this was something that we had, how we understood the ministry is something that we presented at our latest conference. We've had conferences for over 10 years, our 10 years of our history. Most of them have been informational. We've also had a conference in 2017 where we invited those who were opposed to the ordination of women to the diaconate to speak and to dialogue with us. And so this past conference, we focused particularly on this idea of let's move past kind of just talking about the order and try to envision how the church might go about reinstating it or renewing it. And in addition to kind of summarizing the history and the need for this particular order, we presented our guidelines of how we thought maybe it could happen. And these were drafted over many months with, board members, theologians, clergy, and hierarchy. They went through many revisions. And we presented them at the conference. We prefaced the presentation by saying, this is not the final word. This is a working document. We want your impression. We want to hear what you think about this. And we solicited input from there at the conference. And also we had an additional Zoom event where we solicited more input. So to all of those listening, yes, please look at our guidelines and give us your input. We welcome your input because we plan to review them and then take those issues that kind of bubble up and incorporate them. But the question is really twofold. How do we envision the order? And do our orders actually evolve over time? And this was something that Father Radu mentioned earlier. So in 1988, when the Rhodes consultation the international consultation in the Orthodox world that the consensus of which that we should renew this order, said, it was very much to meet the ministerial needs of the day, et cetera. But they didn't really flesh out how it might look. And this is what I mentioned earlier this evening. In 1990, then there was a follow-on conference in Crete that talked about maybe how this order might look. And it mentioned things like giving spiritual counsel, taking communion to the sick. And that's when we also mentioned reading the prayers of the service, anointing the sick and infirm, and assisting the bishop or priest in the liturgical celebration. So you already see kind of a fleshing out of how this might look in the modern era. In 2000, we had a group of French theologians, some very famous ones, Elizabeth Regule, Father Boris Bourbonskoy, Olivier Clément, Nicolas Lasky, some very important names if you're familiar with the kind of Russian-French Orthodox world. And they studied this, the diaconate, the female diaconate, for over a year, and then they wrote to the ecumenical patriarch. And part of what they said in their communique, and I'll read it here, is that the institution of the early church deserves to be revitalized. And it states further that, quote, "It involved more than a simple and archaeological reconstitution of the ancient ministry of deaconess. It is a question of revitalization. In other words, of the realization in the context of culture and the requirements for the day." So it's a little bit anachronistic to think that somehow we could recreate a female diaconate in the 21st century, in the now 21st century, that would somehow look exactly like it did in the 4th century. And if we didn't do that, that somehow we're creating something totally new. And this is the question of how if and how our orders actually evolve. One of the, I think, Father Radu mentioned some examples. Another one I'd like to mention is the order of subdeacon. In the canon of Laodicea 22, it actually says subdeacons should stay at the doors. They shouldn't enter the sanctuary. They shouldn't wear the orarion, and because only the major orders enter the sanctuary. And, if we see today what the subdeacons are doing, they're entering the sanctuary, they're wearing the orarion, and in some places, some jurisdictions, they actually say petitions. So we can see kind of an evolution of that order over time. And it's interesting to note that St. Nectarius, when he did ordain a female deacon in his monastery in the early 20th century, actually did so they could have a fuller liturgical life. So they could say, among other things, give communion to the nuns there and say the petitions of the service. So, as well as read the gospel. So the question is, yes.
Teva, it is 8:25. So,
oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So the only question I would like to wrap up is to say, what would then the main question is how the liturgical role of the female deacon would look. We see the example of the Armenian church where men and women do similar things. And this is the example that we looked towards. So it's not the fact that we want to do, quote unquote, things that men do just to make us valued, which was one of the one of the objections to this, but is that we want to do what the deacon does and to uplift the ministry of the diaconate to its fullest expression for both men and women. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very helpful, Teva. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to, but the last question I'd like to ask both of you is, there is this fear that by reviving the female diaconate, there would be a division in the church. Could you please speak to that?
I'll go first, Teva, if you need a breather. That was beautiful. Thank you. I do not have any historical reasons to fear a schism. Just like the church in Constantinople could have so many deaconesses throughout history, and we heard historical evidence, and there was no schism. I don't think there will be one. St. Nectarius ordained deaconesses, and there was no schism. In 2004, the Synod of Greece approved with a large majority the rejuvenation of the order of deaconesses, and there was no schism. Even more recently, it was 2016, and then in 2017 it actually happened. the Synod of Alexandria and all Africa decided again to move on with ordination of deaconesses. Then they had to backtrack a little bit because of some criticisms through unofficial channels, and there was no schism. I do not worry about the schism if the order of the deaconesses is reinstated, so first timidly in some parts of the world, and then maybe it becomes a little bit more generalized. There are significant differences within the Orthodox Church, not over this issue, but over a very important one related to it, and namely, how often do people receive communion? Because there are Orthodox cultures in which people receive communion maybe once, 2, 3, 4 times a year. And there, the need is not as strong as it is where people receive communion on a consistent basis. But that Eucharistic difference is so much more important and is not cause of division. So this one, which is related to it, again, doesn't make me worry about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Teva?
I just wanted to add that, yeah, this is a matter of practice of the church. There are no doctrinal issues at stake. In 2017, speaking of the Church of Alexandria, when they decided to start the process of reinstituting the female diaconate, there were a bunch of renowned liturgists that in fact spoke to this issue, and they said, and I quote, only doctrinal impediments and commonly authorized precedents would preclude an autocephalous church from enacting liturgical reforms from within its borders. And they continue that the restoration of the female diaconate is such that neither doctrinal issues nor authoritative precedents are at stake. So it's up to the particular autocephalous church if they were to move in this direction. And as Father Radu said, that we in the Orthodox world kind of hold tension. We have a great unity within our diversity. And I think that that's that we can continue to hold that together.
Thank you. So some interesting questions in the chat that I'd like to get to before we end this evening. Somebody is asking if the Orthodox tradition has a curse, and hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, cursus honorum, or course of honor, so that one must first be a deacon. I'm sorry, before one must first be a reader, then acolyte, then subdeacon, and then deacon or deaconess.
Yes, we do, and I had to go through it when I was ordained. I shouldn't say I had. I was called to go through it when I was ordained, and for me, unfortunately, the diaconate was a stepping stone because I was ordained as a deacon for less than 24 hours. The very next day, I was ordained as a priest. But Teva, I thought, presented very clearly the fact that it's a different ministry. It's not a stepping stone. So that cursus honorum that the person who asked the question asked about is the practical way in which people are ordained, but it's not how we see ministries. We see ministries as having their own mission, like Teva said. And just to clarify, I am an Orthodox priest. I have no intention of becoming a bishop. Because you would think that this argument would then automatically mean that I will become a bishop, but I don't. I will not. Most Orthodox priests that you know do not become bishops after that. So why would we assume that a deaconess would automatically become a priest later on? It's not a valid concern, meaning I'm not concerned about that.
I just wanted to add, for those of you who don't know, the cursus honorum is a Roman military term, which basically means you go up through the ranks. Yes. And in the Byzantine tradition, as I understand it, you start at the subdiaconate level, and then you move to the diaconate. Now, in the Slavic tradition, of which the Romanians, Father Radu, are actually influenced, they do start at the kind of the reader level, although, and then you go kind of the subdeacon. So it has, and it's clearly in terms of the reader, it's an addendum to the end of to the text, because they've already been given the scripture from which to read, and then at the very, very, very end, after that, they speak of it in those terms. So I think I'll stop there, but that's basically the understanding, or rather the skewed understanding of how we understand our ministries.
Thank you very much. So another question is, if there are priests and bishops who approve of female deacons, then why hasn't it been done?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I think that there's certainly bishops are in charge of the unity of the church, and that is something that they are conscious of. And so, whereas theoretically they could ordain a woman tomorrow, they probably would not do so unless they had the consensus of their particular synod. And it is within the purview of the each autocephalous church to do so. So I think what our church, what is necessary for us as the St. Phoebe Center, is to get the church ready for whatever particular move might come in the future from a bishop, because they will not move unless, of course, we are ready.
Father, did you have something to add to that?
Yes. The way I hear the question and the way I think Teva answered it was, why isn't it like a generalized practice or something that we hear about all the time? But I would not go as far as to say that it hasn't been done. So we just mentioned the example of St. Nectarios, who ordained 2 deaconesses. There's also then he was Metropolitan Christodoulos, who later became the Archbishop of Greece. But in 1986, he ordained a nun. And we just mentioned the Patriarchate of Alexandria that ordained 5 deaconesses, if I remember correctly. And if I understand correctly, there will be another ordination in these coming months or weeks. I wouldn't go as far as to say it hasn't been done, but these are timid beginnings, which we should not disconsider. And this is how things grow. Somebody has to start, and it's timid in the beginning, and then it becomes much more common practice.
Thank you, Father. I want to honor everybody's time. It's 8:34, so I would like to close, but I want to thank our wonderful panelists for what they shared with us this evening. And thank you so much. I want to thank all of you who have attended and listened to us, and the wonderful comments and questions in the chat. Before we leave, I just want to remind you that we have an upcoming event on Sunday, May 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern. That is the Sunday of the Myrrh Bearers. And it is this Zoom event is called or titled Exploring the Need for Diaconal Ministry in the Female Diaconate. So we will be exploring that need. And that is, again, Sunday, May 19th at 7 p.m. So if you subscribe to our newsletter, or you are on our social media, or you go to our website, you will be seeing more about how to register for that. So thank you again. God bless you all, and have a wonderful evening.